on the TNT Show. Good evening and welcome to the Nation Talks. You know, it's been another great day for British democracy. We hear on the one hand that Gibraltar is about to create its own separate arrangements, these dreadful separatists over there, and also the border that might have taken place in the North Sea or Northern Ireland is now going to be, in all places, it's going to be in Kent. There's going to be a border in Kent to control the flow of goods and services. So effectively, if you're living in Kent, you're going to be in part of some enormous lorry park, truck park in the future. Think of this simple calculation. The average articulated lorry is about 16.5 meters in length. And if you assume a gap of 1 meter between each truck, and there are 1,609 meters in a mile, if you do the math with 7,000 lorries, that's the UK's figure, the UK government's figure, that would be 115,500 meters of a tailback. In old money, that's 76 miles. So the poor folks in Kent are going to be confronted with a 76-mile tailback. You couldn't make it up. You really couldn't. Thanks for joining us this evening. We have yet another great guest, and I'm really excited that he's able to be with us tonight. Stay tuned to hear all about someone who has thought very long and seriously about the currency in a newly independent Scotland. And we're taking your questions live. First, a few words about TNT. The Nation Talks. So in many respects, this is your show. You will see the contact details on the screen. You can also write to me direct right now, if you like, to john@cleish.com. That's Cleish spelled CLEISH.com. Just drop me an email. We'll try and take your questions live on the show. 60 minutes of live questions. What more could you ask for? So it's very much your show. Make the best use of that time, please. And now to our guest. Tonight, the Nation talks to Dr. Tim Rideout, the first Maxman to feature on TNT, another first. How are you doing, Tim?
Oh, I'm doing fine. I'm looking forward to talking to you for the next hour.
How are you coping with COVID?
Okay, I've mostly been at home, but only been out of S-Bank, well, Dalkeith, about twice or three times since March.
Yeah. And you always wear your mask, right?
In the shops or something, yes.
Yeah, that's what we like to hear. That's what we like to hear. Tell us a little bit about your background, Tim. Now, you were born, as I said, in the Isle of Man, but then you spent some time in South Africa.
Yeah, that's right. I grew up on a farm and halfway between Douglas and Castletown. And then after my father had an accident, he got trampled on by some of the cattle that we had. And so he was advised to give up farming because it would be, maybe lead to rheumatism and arthritis and things if he was out in the all weathers. And we had my mother had an uncle in Cape Town. We'd been there once on holiday, and it seemed like a place that would be sensible to go. This was end of 1974. I had another year at prep school in Cheshire, and then I went in 1975.
And how did you find the connection between your school that you were at before and schooling in South Africa? Was there a lot of commonality, or was it very, very different?
I really liked the school in Cheshire. It was a rather unusual place called Mostyn House. It was the headmaster's great-grandfather, I think, had founded it, so it was very much a family business. It was a boys' boarding school, and they didn't believe, for example, in homework. So the 5 years I was there, we never had homework. The headmaster said it was a waste of time. And what we had in the evenings was what he called occupations. And occupations were things like chess, bridge, metalwork, woodwork, model railways, photography, astronomy, and things like that. So the school had, they had a photographic darkroom. If you did photography, you went and mixed your chemicals, exposed your photographic paper, developed it, all that sort of thing. You didn't realize you were actually doing chemistry.
Oh, fantastic. What a great approach. And how was South Africa compared to that?
The high school in South Africa, a place called Bishops, styles itself as the Eton of South Africa. And to me, it was like Tom Brown's school days. We still had fagging, which meant you had to sort of go running off to the tuck shop for a prefect or polish his shoes or something like that. Very much into, you should get 2 hours homework sat in a classroom every evening. I usually put my books on the table so nobody could see and then went to sleep.
And yet, despite all of that, you're bristling with degrees. How many degrees do you have?
Well, I've got a BA and then an honours, which in South Africa count as separate. Got a master's degree and a PhD.
In what subjects?
I did a double major for the BA, which was geography and economics, with economic history as well, and a few outside subjects like maths, statistics, and computer science. And then after that, I've concentrated on economic geography.
Terrific, super. Well, you're well positioned to talk about our main subject later on, perhaps. So tell us about your career. What have you been doing up until where you are now?
Well, I really always fancied being an academic. That was sort of really why I sort of wanted to do things like the PhD, because sort of really necessary for any advancement in the sort of university world. I used to spend my sort of student days collecting rock samples and slides of urban environments and whatever, which are all going to be used for my teaching in the future. But in the early 1990s, when I might have found a post in a university, and I was a research assistant in Edinburgh for some years, but they were just temporary contracts and there was no really permanent lectureships available. This was the time of the Thatcher and Major cuts.
Oh, yeah.
And I was offered a job at Bartholomew's, the Edinburgh map maker.
Oh, yeah.
It really arose because I'd done all the maps for my master's degree and my PhD digitally on the early sort of automated mapping systems. I taught myself to use those.
Mm. And how did you find
map making is a bit of an accident, really.
And how's that working out? How's map making working out for you? Because you produced a map of Scotland, didn't you?
Well, we've done lots of maps. We've got, I think, was about 600 or 700 listed on Amazon at the moment, or on our own xyzmaps.com website. But the ones people in Scotland have seen were the ones which featured in the National, which we did a series of 3 maps. There's a European Union map, a world map, and a British Isles map. And they all show Scotland as a completely independent, separate country with an international border, Edinburgh as the capital. And we've labelled it, the other bit is the United Kingdom of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
Well, that might have to be modified soon if we, from what we can gather tonight.
The Europe map was the most popular. It's the European Union, so we have England out, Scotland still in. We also show Catalonia as an independent country. Ah,
fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. So let's move on to the subject that is probably central to our discussion tonight. What's your view about the currency in an independent Scotland?
Well, it's really very simple, and it's probably about the only thing that I agree with Professor Ronald MacDonald, is the Adam Smith Professor of Macroeconomics at Glasgow University. He tends to feature extensively in Tory party press releases, which is why I would probably not agree with him about much. But he did say that if Scotland was to be independent, the only sensible choice is to have its own currency, and the worst possible choice would be sterlingisation. And he's right. I agree with him on that. It's exactly the same position as I have, that if you're going to be an independent country, you have to have your own currency, and there really isn't a choice about it.
Okay, let's just take us through that, because sterlingisation has been recommended as an approach, I think, by the Growth Commission, and we talked about this last week with Andrew Wilson. Why do you think that sterlingisation would be a mistake?
Well, on the surface, it looks like a sensible option by which nothing changes. The pensioner still has the same banknotes as they do today. Your bank account stays the same, and it looks like nothing's changed. And for the man in the street, it hasn't. But the problem is that behind the scenes, your house looks exactly the same. The bathroom still works, but all that's happened is that the plumbing's been disconnected, and you don't realize that until it's too late. So as soon as you're outside the sterling zone, then we have no control over sterling. We have no say in how it's run. Things like our interest rate is going to be set in London, and they're not going to be interested in whether we like what they set or not. The exchange rate's going to be decided in London. We don't have any lender of last resort. People go on, where's your lender of last resort? Well, in sterlingization, there is no lender of last resort. If you take, say, the Clydesdale Bank, it's a fairly small bank. I think it has assets or liabilities of about £35 billion. So that's quite small when the Royal Bank of Scotland was over £1 trillion. But if the Clydesdale Bank went bust and the Scottish government was asked to pay us the 80,000 euros, or the 80,000 pounds, the 100,000 euros guarantee that they have supposedly on everyone's bank account, where would the Scottish government get the £35 billion from? They don't have it themselves, they can't get it from anywhere. So effectively, whatever the guarantee you think you have on the bank account, it doesn't exist in reality because there's no money that could actually pay it out if it was asked to do so. And again, the Scottish government, it can't finance its deficit. It will have a deficit. And the only place they're going to be able to get that from is to go off to London and try and sort of beg and borrow on the international market to get the sterling. There's another issue, which is that in Scotland we have a lot of foreign-owned companies, which most of the North Sea, a lot of the whiskey industry, so on, it's all foreign-owned, which means the profits are taken out of Scotland. So there's a big flow, quite a large flow of sterling that is going out all the time as those profits are repatriated. Now, at the moment, it's replaced because we're part of the UK system, but that stops. So, how do you finance that outflow? You're going to have to suppress domestic demand, which means, it's taxing us and stopping us spending money so that you can free up more goods to export, so that you can increase the export revenues and reduce the imports, and therefore get the sterling that is necessary to keep us afloat. It's just not a sensible way to go. It's full of risks. I think the Scottish government will probably be in some sort of permanent fiscal crisis.
So in short, you think that sterlingization would be a disaster?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily be a disaster immediately, but it can turn into a disaster at any moment. And anytime it does, there's nothing you can do about it other than just sort of panic. But the Scottish government is entirely defenceless.
Yeah. What do you say to the criticism that this is all very well and good, but it'd be very difficult to explain to a skeptical electorate during a referendum, and the opposition would make hay with the fact that this is an untried arrangement?
Well, it's not an untried arrangement. Every country that's become independent has introduced its own currency, I think, almost without exception. When you think of, it's not that long ago, we can, the older among us can quite clearly remember when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and all the places like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, within a year or two, they all introduced their own currency, and I don't think any of them had any particular trouble about doing that. So you can even do it very quickly because if you remember the Czechoslovak Republic, it split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and they agreed that they would have a currency union. So you'd say, well, that's like we were going to do after 2014, we were going to have a currency union. Well, that currency union lasted for 5 weeks before it collapsed. And the Slovaks were then faced with having to introduce a currency without doing any preparation for it. But they still managed it in about 2 months.
2 months, okay. So, we've had some questions coming in. Here we go. Billy Holland on Facebook is asking, was Mark Carney right when he stated that the Bank of England were preparing for full digital currency to happen between 10 and 20 years' time?
He may be. I'm not greatly in favour of a full digital currency. I think it's quite a good idea to keep cash. It's not it's not that widely used in the UK. The UK is not necessarily exactly typical of everywhere else, because in Germany, latest figures I saw from last year were that 70% of all transactions were in cash. My father-in-law was German, and he would never use a card on principle for anything. And when he bought us a set of bedroom furniture, then that was 3,000 euros in cash in his wallet. And so it was a big out-of-town furniture shop, a bit like sort of size of IKEA. They didn't actually accept credit cards. We had that a few years ago, trying to buy a microwave for my mother-in-law when she was still with us, so that she could heat up her Meals on Wheels. And we went to this big place like equivalent of Currys in Germany, and I tried to pay with a Visa card, and they wouldn't accept it.
Really?
No.
They wanted cash?
They would take what they call a Euro card, which is a sort of German-only debit card,
Right.
or it was cash.
Yeah.
That was it.
Now, I mean, you raise an interesting point there. I wonder what's happening in Germany as a result of COVID-19. I mean, I suspect people are using less and less cash because it's just not practical. And if we're about to go back into some form of lockdown or semi-lockdown, again, it sort of rather suggests that people will be asked to use cards rather than cash, because...
Yeah, although I think the WHO's latest view is that it's very unlikely you're going to catch the virus from a banknote. But I think the reason for keeping some cash goes beyond that. My mother, for example, is still living in Cape Town, and at the moment they're getting, because of failure to invest in the electricity system, they're getting rotational power cuts of up to 8 hours every day.
Right.
None of the digital payment systems work during those power cuts.
Of course. If you don't have electricity, you don't have any internet, I assume. And
the other thing with all your electronic transactions, that they're all tracked. The bank knows every single thing that you've ever purchased, and they can provide that to the tax authorities or the police or anyone else. So if you've been to a dodgy massage parlor or something, they know all about it.
Yeah. Actually, joking apart, my son recommended that I have a Revolut card. And one of the striking things about that is that as soon as you make a transaction, almost as soon as you make a transaction, it appears on your phone. So one assumes that applies to every credit card transaction or debit card transaction, that the card issuer has that information pretty much instantaneously.
Oh, yeah, they do.
And they've just chosen not to share it. Revolut, for some reason, I've thought there's some edge in it by sharing it with the customer.
The other thing with the cards is the bank is taking between 0.3 and 2%.
Yeah.
Whereas on cash, they don't get anything. So obviously the banks love digital payments.
Yeah. Right, more questions. Anne Ubeluk is asking, Annette Irving is asking on Facebook, how long will it take to set up our own currency? Well, in my timetable, which you can find at the reservebank.scot website on the /timetable page, I'm predicting we have about 2 years of transition period before Independence Day, so in between the referendum and actual Independence Day, which I've got the referendum next September, and then I'm picking St. Andrew's Day 2023 as Independence Day. Okay. So that would be 2 years, 2 months. And that's in that time, you're busy getting the central bank legislation through Holyrood, getting the premises of the central bank established, which you can see in the picture behind me, already belong to the taxpayer, so it doesn't cost anything. And designing the notes. I think we should have a national competition to design the banknotes, getting them manufactured, and then being ready to introduce the new currency approximately 2 months after Independence Day. So my plan at the last weekend of January 2024. Yeah, oh, that sounds pretty thorough. Mandy Garden is asking this question on Facebook. Could Tim please explain the differences between the currency zone and the currency union? and which would be better for an independent Scotland? I think you've probably answered the last question, but she would like to know the difference between the currency zone and the currency union.
Well, if we use sterling, we'd effectively be part of a sterling currency zone, which in the 1960s, for example, the sterling zone was really quite large because it covered many of the former or then still current British colonies. Yep. But they all gradually left the sterling zone and it went their own way on currency. The currency union is different because that means we would have a legal formal agreement between the UK government and the Scottish government that they would share and jointly control sterling. So we'd have to have directors in the Bank of England, and the finance minister in Scotland would discuss with the UK Chancellor about what was going to happen on interest rates and so forth. So that's a bit.
That can only happen, I think, through agreement with the remaining UK government, as it were.
I mean, it's quite possible, and in 2014 it might well have happened if there'd been a yes vote, that the UK would immediately come running along saying, please, 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 can we have a currency union? They weren't going to do that before the vote, but they might have afterwards, simply because they probably need Scotland as part of the sterling zone to prop up sterling.
Why would they need Scotland to be in the currency union to prop it up? What would happen to the currency if Scotland weren't there to prop it up?
Well, I think what will probably happen is that the Scottish pound, or whatever you want to call it, you could call it the merk, which was the old silver coin of Scotland, which was the same derivation as the German mark. But I think it will tend to rise against sterling, and that the problem for us will be a little bit like Switzerland of trying to stop it rising.
And how would that be done?
Well, stopping your currency rising is quite easy. It just means you have to create more of it and sell it into the foreign exchange market. Which means, and if you're selling your currency, you're buying foreign currencies, so that creating that money and selling it into the foreign exchange market just increases your foreign reserves.
Yeah, cool. And yeah, we're getting loads of questions, Tim. Here's one that's perfectly understandable. It's from Sean Collins. He's saying, does Scotland have any place that it can print currency?
Not as far as I know of, because you have to have a security printer. So somebody like De La Rue, I was reading yesterday, I think it was, that there are about 3 or 4 main companies in the world that print banknotes.
Yeah.
De La Rue's one, but I think most of their production is in Malta. Used to be in the UK, but the new UK passport is also done by a security printer, and that's manufactured in Poland.
Oh, right. Okay.
So when Boris gets his black passport, or whatever colour it is, it's going to have a little gold lettering on the back saying printed in the European Union.
Oh, you couldn't make it up. You really couldn't. So am I right in thinking that De La Rue is perhaps an organisation, a company used by loads of currencies? I mean,
yeah, the Bank of England used them.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, they used to do all their production in the UK, but as I said, a lot of it's been moved abroad.
Yeah. Melanie McCain, this is a comment. She seems to be endorsing what you said about Germany in particular. She says, keep cash. I live in Sweden and I've used cash twice this year. Half the places make it hard and the other half impossible. So she's saying it's hard to use cash in Sweden. They may have some particular.
Yeah, I just think that there's snags, and they're not necessarily immediately apparent. But for example, in the 1870s, there was a solar flare, which was a very large one, and it knocked out all of the planetary telegraph systems at the time. Now, fortunately, electricity wasn't very widely used in the 1870s, but we haven't had a flare of that size since, apparently, and we're overdue for one. I was reading some astronomical journal article somewhere, and if we do get another one like that, it could knock out all of the world's telephone systems for potentially several weeks.
Really?
So, if you've gone for entirely a digital currency, even in a war, one of these nuclear radiation pulses, where it just affects electronic stuff. You could bring down the UK power grid with one of those over the North Sea, in which case then we're all stuffed because all the money stops working.
Right. Oh, great. Can you take us through, in fairly rudimentary steps, what Scotland would have to do in order to set up its own currency? You said earlier it might take 2 years. What would these 2 years be required in order to do? What would need to be done in those 2 years?
Well, in the first instance, we need an act to go through the Scottish Parliament, which I've called the Scottish Reserve Bank Establishment Bill. And that would just sort of define the principles for the bank. So it's going to have a president and directors. It will be headquartered in Edinburgh, that it will be responsible for introducing the currency and things like banking licenses and stuff like that. And I have a resolution at the moment, which I'm submitting to the next SNP conference, which basically puts these principles in it. And I do allow the bank to license any bank in Scotland to issue its own banknotes. So the Clydesdale Royal Bank, Bank of Scotland could carry on doing their own notes, but I would also let things like Santander do their own notes if they want to as well. But all of that's in the principles of the bill. But the most important thing is that the bank should be clearly seen as being an important part of the state, and it should be answerable to Parliament and under democratic control. Yeah. So, the Bank of England belongs to the Treasury. It's got one shareholder, which is the Treasury. The Chancellor tells the directors what to do, and yet we're in this sort of neoliberal myth. We pretend that somehow the Bank of England is independent. It isn't, and it shouldn't be, because why would you want to put a bunch of bankers in charge of running your economy?
Well, it's scary to me. I watched what they did in 2008, and now I wouldn't want any repetition of that.
It never was independent. It was nationalised in 1946 precisely to make it not independent.
Yeah. And
up until Gordon Brown in 1998, it was the Chancellor who decided what the interest rate was and so on. And then we had this, basically imported from the US, the idea that politicians shouldn't be in charge of anything. We need to hand it over to technocrats who run everything much better.
Yeah.
And of course, we got a group of bankers in charge who then ran the economy into the ground in order to feather their own nests.
Yeah. Well, talking about Gordon Brown, do you think he was right or otherwise to get rid of the gold reserve?
Well, gold was what John Maynard Keynes described as a barbaric relic, I think was what he described it as. But unfortunately, Gordon Brown managed to didn't sell all the gold, but he sold a lot of the gold, and he managed to sell it at the bottom of the market. So that wasn't very clever.
And yet we're always told that the UK government is a centre of competence. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we don't actually have very much gold. I think I looked up the figures the other day. It was £18 billion worth, whereas Germany's got 350 billion euros worth.
Aye, well, but we've still got all of Venezuela's gold as well, don't we? Somewhere.
Yeah, we've been refusing to give it back to them, which is
I'm not sure.
That means that other countries will take their gold away from London and put it somewhere else.
That would be the logical step, wouldn't it? I'm not a member, so you'll have to excuse my ignorance. Where does the SNP stand in what you're describing? I mean, what is the SNP's policy in terms of currency? Is it the Growth Commission, or is
no? Because the April 2019 conference rejected the Growth Commission's plan, and I've got the exact wording here. If you just find it on the right page. The policy that the SNP adopted by vote of the delegates, and there had to be a full card vote, was: conference considers that an SNP government should take the steps necessary to enable the Scottish Parliament to authorise the preparation of a Scottish currency as soon as practicable after a vote for independence, with the aim that the currency be ready for introduction as soon as practicable after Independence Day. Now, that is the policy. That's what the delegates voted for. And I know Andrew Wilson thinks as soon as practicable is about somewhere between 10 and 15 years, but I don't think anyone else would read that as being that length of time. Okay.
Well, I wasn't aware of that. Ruth Hanratty is asking, look, I live in Tenerife. Should I be concerned about access to my Bank of Scotland account in the light of recent news? not quite sure what the recent news is, but
well, this is the fact that because the UK is withdrawing from or has withdrawn from the European Union and is now leaving the single market and the customs zone, it's really that bit which is the important bit. Then the European Union has said that the UK banks no longer have passporting rights, and therefore it's illegal for them to trade in the rest of the EU.
Oh,
I don't see that it should necessarily mean that you can't access your account here via internet banking, but this is a bit to do with the individual banks. I think it's up to them to decide whether they wish to get a license in, whichever country it is, and then carry on serving their customers, or whether they're going to decide that, say, Slovakia is not worth it. They're not going to bother.
Yeah.
So I suspect that there's so many British people in Spain that the main banks will probably get authorised to carry on servicing those customers. But they don't have to.
I'm just wondering what sort of oversight there is, particularly in terms of difficulties with accessing accounts for cards like Revolut, where you can change currencies. You can do it instantly. You can move sterling into euros and vice versa. I mean, how does the bank oversee that? I mean, it's an electronic transaction. I mean, it just happens quickly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my mother in Cape Town has an account in the Isle of Man, so she has to do it by telephone banking because we could never manage to get the internet stuff set up to work in South Africa.
Yeah.
But that was more to do with the fact that the bank kept insisting on sending the PIN number by post, and a letter to South Africa takes about 2 months to arrive. Yeah. By which time it says this PIN number is valid for 10 days. And they refused to send it by courier because it was going to be too expensive.
Oh, gracious. Okay, what is your view on modern monetary theory, which we discussed briefly with Andrew last week? What's your take on that?
Well, what I think's happening at the moment is that there's a paradigm shift happening in macroeconomics. I mean, this happens every sort of 30 to 40 years. In the immediate post-war period, everyone was a Keynesian, the world economy between 1945 and about 1980, most governments pursued Keynesian policies, which was basically that if you had unemployment, the solution was to increase the state spending to generate extra demand and mop up the unemployment.
Yeah.
And then with people like Milton Friedman in the 1970s, I remember in South Africa as a student watching a TV series he did called Free to Choose, which was all about the terrible mess the state made of everything, and you really needed to have freedom of choice in the free market. So healthcare would be much better done in the free market. Education was much better in the free market than all of this sort of stuff. And that gave rise to sort of Thatcherism and Reaganomics. They minimise the state, cut tax, privatise, and hand everything over to the private sector. And I think that was, it's often referred to as neoliberalism or neoclassical economics by some people. And what I think we've seen with things like the 2007-2008 crash, nobody following that economics predicted the crash or had any explanation afterwards for why it had happened. I think it's taken a decade, but that sort of whole theory is essentially collapsing under its internal contradictions. I remember as an economics student, that the big sort of sexy thing coming in third year economics around about 1981 was what they called rational expectations, which was part of that whole thing that everyone was perfectly rational. They had perfect knowledge of the market, and that you before you went shopping in Morrison's, you knew what the price of baked beans was in every supermarket, and therefore you could you could perfectly rationally choose which was the best one to purchase in.
Yeah.
And it's just not true. It's complete rubbish. People are not rational. You make a purchase because you like the colour, or because you like the actor you saw in the TV advert wearing that jacket, or something like that. We're just not rational. And the same thing goes in the stock markets. Stockbrokers, investors, whatever, they follow the herd. If there's a stampede to buy shares, everyone joins in the stampede. It's not rational. It's completely irrational. As I think, what did some central banker call it? Irrational exuberance or something. But that's what you do, and it's like a shoal of fish that if everyone in the London financial community buys the same share at the same in the same period, it turns out to be completely duff, then you can't be sacked because everyone's doing the same thing.
Yeah.
So the safety in numbers the same as there is for a shoal of herring. If you're the brilliant investor who goes against the trend, like say Warren Buffett, that's very dangerous because if you're right and you make £1 billion or something like George Soros did betting against the pound, it's great. Everyone says he's a genius, but if you turn out to be wrong, then you get sacked because you're out on your own, and everyone can clearly see you made a mistake.
Yeah.
So it's not rational, and so what I think is happening now is that people have been looking around for new solutions. There was in 2010 there was this student revolt at Manchester University where the students refused to listen to any more of the economics lectures because they said they were all rubbish, and they insisted that the curriculum be redrawn. And at that stage, a lot of British universities weren't teaching anything except rational expectations and that sort of Chicago school economics. So you had students who were graduating who didn't know who Keynes was, and they'd never been exposed to Marxist economics. They didn't know what the Great Depression in the 1930s was.
Yeah.
It was all groupthink. All the staff, the students, whatever, they were all in the same groupthink with no real critical appreciation of what they were doing or why they were doing it. And what's happened is various other people that they've, in a sense, gone back a little bit towards Keynesianism. But modern monetary theory isn't just sort of rebadged Keynesianism. It goes a bit beyond that, but it's really just looking at how money actually works. And the fact that the people often say, "Oh, but isn't it backed with gold?" Well, no, it isn't. That stopped in 1971. A lot of the traditional economics was based around the sort of gold standard type theories of having to maintain your gold reserves and restrict the way the currency worked and so forth. That's all history. It doesn't apply anymore. So I think we're just sort of, somebody said science proceeds one funeral at a time. And a new generation of economists are coming up who are saying, well, basically the previous lot doesn't work. And we've had another look at this, and we have modified macroeconomic theory to take account of what we think is the way that money actually works in the 21st century.
Let me ask you this question now, which might hopefully help in teasing out why this is different. Margaret Thatcher famously claimed that there was no such thing as society, but I gather that a bigger mistake, almost leaving aside the slight obscenity of that statement, is she claimed that a country, it was exactly like a household. You had to be very cognizant of how much you earned and how much you spent, and you had to balance your budget all the time. She had that wrong, didn't she?
That's absolutely wrong. And a country with a currency is nothing like a household. Has anyone ever heard of a Chancellor of the Exchequer lying awake at night wondering how he's going to meet the debt payment on Friday? No. Whereas private debts, private households, people commit suicide over not being able to meet their mortgage payment.
And the reason that the Chancellor can sleep easily is why? Why can he sleep easily and yet a householder can't?
Because he owns his own bank, and he can simply instruct the bank to give him whatever he wishes to spend.
So he can tell
there was an American one who said that the easiest way to get rich wasn't to commit a burglary, it was to buy a bank.
Yeah. So the Chancellor can literally instruct the Bank of England, perhaps, simply to print money anytime he likes, or she likes.
Well, I don't like the term printing money. It's not printing money these days. It's just creating money. So, but the government has an overdraft facility at the Bank of England. It's called the Ways and Means account. And it's always been there. And, the Chancellor can simply write a cheque or send a digital payment, and the Bank of England will never refuse that. Can you imagine, the Governor of the Bank of England saying, getting on the phone, excuse me, Mr. Sunak, but we've got a cheque here that you wrote, which has been presented today, and you have until 4 p.m. to pay insufficient funds, otherwise we'll have to bounce it.
Yeah. So you're saying
somebody took the governor of the somebody took the governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia to task in a sort of journalist sort of photo sort of call type thing, and asked, are there any circumstances where the Reserve Bank is going to refuse a government payment? And after a great deal of umming and ahhing and trying to evade the question, they finally said there are no such circumstances.
Yeah, yeah. So at any moment in time, for any reason, the Chancellor of the Exchequer can require the Bank of England to fund pretty much anything he desires.
Yes.
Okay. So in that case, why do we need austerity?
We didn't. It was a policy choice that suited the Conservative Party to provide an excuse to shrink the state and try and get rid of the welfare state.
So
that's my view.
Yeah. So austerity is not about having to find money. It's about social engineering.
Yes. Yeah. Austerity is a policy which will it shrinks the state, allows you to say we can't afford pensions, or we can't afford to pay unemployment benefits, or things like that. And to the extent that you manage to reduce the government's deficit or even turn it into a surplus, the government and the private sector are just two sides of the same, of one coin. If the government manages to run a surplus, it means the private sector is running a deficit.
Okay.
And vice versa. If the government runs a deficit, the private sector has a surplus. Which is, before anyone picks me up, it's slightly simplistic, and I am aware that ignores the external foreign sector. But for simplicity, if we just say it's public sector, private sector, it's a double entry accounting system. If one side's in deficit, the other side's in surplus. And so if the government runs a surplus, that means they push the citizens into debt instead.
So austerity is a policy choice. It's not
you push the citizens into debt by, the most obvious example is students graduating in England with a £50,000 debt. Who owns that debt? It's the very wealthy, and they now collect the debt with interest, and it's a policy that simply causes wealth to flow up to those at the top.
Yeah. So austerity is a choice. Let me bring in a question here, if I may. Anne Oberleek, sorry, Anne, if I've mispronounced your name, apologies. Her question is, will it make any difference in our pensions when we have our own currency?
Probably not, but there is a negotiation that will have to take place with the UK about the state pension. And that in international law, the UK already declared in 2014 that it wanted to be what's called the continuing state in terms of the Vienna Convention. And they want to be the continuing state because if they're not the continuing state, they lose the UN seat on the Security Council, which would be declared vacant and given to somebody else. So the UK has to be the continuing state. And in international law, the continuing state gets the assets. So they get the Falkland Islands, they get the embassy in Washington, and all of that sort of stuff. And they also get the liabilities. So they get the national debt and whatever pension liabilities they've built up over the years. Why there would probably be a negotiation is because unlike, for example, say the civil service pensions in Scotland, I think a lot of the councils, they all have a funded pension scheme. But the state pension is not funded, it's just paid out of current tax revenues. So there is no, the National Insurance Fund, I think, has about £15 billion in it. That's not there because it's invested in anything. It's there because it's just transitory between when national insurance comes in and when it gets paid out. So I think what will probably happen is after a vote for independence, Scottish Government and the UK Government will agree that the state pension will transfer to the Scottish Government. And because the Scottish Government is then collecting the national insurance contributions, they would then have the money to pay the existing state pension. I suspect we'd probably ask for some sort of lump sum to cover transition arrangements, but that would, maybe a few billion or something like that. The other thing to bear in mind is that, unfortunately, the life expectancy of people in Scotland, due to a lot of ill health and so on, industrial past and all that sort of thing, is less. So a man in Easterhouse has a life expectancy of about 72 years, which means they only get a state pension for 4 years. And therefore, if they were on average earnings in their lifetime, they only get back about 50% of what they paid in. Yeah. Whereas a man in Kensington has a life expectancy of about 91, and therefore they get back about 160% of what they would have paid in terms of their, if they'd been on average earnings, which they probably weren't on average earnings, they'd probably been on more. But I suspect that if we worked it all out, the Scottish Government, given the existing national insurance, could probably afford to increase the existing state pension without incurring any additional cost.
Yeah. So right now, if I understand you right, poor people are paying for rich people's pensions.
Yeah, well, those that don't live very long are subsidising those who do live a long time. That's how any pension system
and those are predominantly poor people. What do you make of the oft-repeated saying by many politicians on all sides of the political spectrum, which is we have to have a balanced budget. We have to balance the books. The other guy's not going to balance the books, but I shall. Vote for me. What do you make of that statement?
It's a pretty stupid statement. The government should run the economy so that we maximise employment. We achieve what economics calls full employment. Basically, everyone who has a job, who wants a job, has a job, and that's the job of the government. They're elected by us to work in our interest, and what we want is a decent, well-paid job, and that's what the government should be trying to achieve. And they do that by their spending and their tax choices. So if you're in a situation where there is major unemployment, it means that the government is either not spending enough, or that it's spending on the wrong things, or it's taxing too much. So it needs to do something about that. You would, maybe, well, for example, you could stop charging VAT on house alterations, because that obviously reduces the number of house alterations that people do. And if you're like the situation in the early 2000s where the UK economy was overheating and house prices are going through the roof and things like that, then that means that the government is spending too much or it's taxing too little. So, what Gordon Brown should have been increasing the taxes on houses and house transfers and things like that in order to dampen down the housing bubble that was taking place. The fact that he actually didn't do that, he increased civil service salaries and increased government spending, just meant that he was pouring petrol on the fire instead of trying to put it out. So I don't think it's really rocket science. And what I'm saying is not radical, because I listened to a lecture by Lord Adair Turner, who past chairman of the CBI, I think, who in 2016 gave a lecture in Dublin, basically saying exactly what I'm saying, that the Monetary Policy Committee should look at the state of the economy, and if it's not doing very well, they should tell the Chancellor, right, well, we're allocating 50 billion to you this quarter to spend. And if it's overheating, then they tell the Chancellor, we're taking 50 billion back, so you'll have to put tax up.
So it's a complete nonsense then to talk about the need to balance the books.
Yes. Well, over 2 or 3 centuries, yes, but in the short term, no, because then you're basically saying the government's abdicating its responsibility for running the economy because we think having a nice balance sheet is more important.
Yeah. What would you say to people who, I'm sure a lot of people watching and listening to this will be very surprised by some of the things you've said. For example, a country with monetary sovereignty could effectively create its own money. Surely that they'll be thinking that would just cause inflation.
No, it won't necessarily cause inflation. I think inflation is actually quite difficult to get going. The Japanese central bank, Japanese government, they've been trying to get inflation going for the last 30 years, ever since their crash in 1990, and they failed completely. They've run the Japanese national debt up to nearly 300% of GDP, and they're still struggling to avoid deflation.
Yeah, but it is a risk.
I think what you need to get inflation off the ground is usually something like a war or an external shock. And I think we've got enough time to say, but I think the UK could actually be setting up exactly the perfect conditions for an inflationary shock in 2021, because what are we doing? We're aiming for a no-deal Brexit, with 7,000 lorries parked in Kent, all trade through Dover coming to a halt, empty shelves in the supermarket. At that time of year, I believe 70% of our food is imported because it's the middle of winter and nothing's growing. Meanwhile, there was a leak from the Treasury 2 weeks ago, I think, which basically suggested that Michael Gove is hatching a cunning plan with the Chancellor to demonstrate to the people in England, mostly, that Brexit is a fantastic success by increasing the government's handouts. So, for example, one of the things they were going to do was provide monetary compensation to any company which said it had lost money as a result of Brexit. So Jaguar, Land Rover, Nissan, whatever. But they also want to demonstrate that the man in the street is getting his 350 million a week back from Brussels. And they've now discovered that the Bank of England can create all this money for them and that there's no limits. So they're going to start handing it out. So now you've got a situation where, due to the coronavirus, we've lost 20% of the GDP. We could now, according to Goldman Sachs, do the same again with a hard Brexit. So you've just shrunk the economy's productive capacity by maybe 30%, combined with the government creating lots of extra money. That's how you start hyperinflation. It's the same as Robert Mugabe destroying the commercial agriculture system in Zimbabwe and then handing all wads of banknotes to all his supporters.
That's scary. That, Tim, that is scary. So what would you reckon?
I don't think the people in London have any idea of the dangers that they're playing with. I can remember things like the Toxteth riots and Brixton and things like that. And if you end up with, say, 15% unemployment because furloughs ended and the hospitality sector's all gone bust and so forth, then combine that with an empty shelf in the supermarket and no bog roll, and what's going to happen?
Yeah, you're going to rioting in the streets, perhaps.
My business partner has just bought a new BMW motorbike, and the BMW dealer says just as well you're buying it now because the price is going up 15% on the 1st of January.
Oh, really? As a result of Brexit?
Yes. That's because of the import tariff on motorcycles.
Yeah. Well, there you are, folks. If you want to buy something from abroad, now's the time to do it. You don't want to leave it for much longer. So while you're out there buying your bog rolls, have a thought that you might want to buy something else that comes from overseas. Because I think bog rolls are made overseas, aren't they?
Well, they're not, but the pulp is imported.
Oh, what's imported?
The paper.
Oh, the paper's imported. Okay. So the rolls are made here, but the paper has to come from elsewhere. Is that right?
Yeah, it mostly comes from Sweden, I think.
Oh, Sweden. Okay. Oh, gracious. Things are getting crazier and crazier.
You can always recycle the Daily Mail or something and use that instead.
Okay, great one. Excellent news. Fine. Here's somebody on Periscope saying, this is really interesting. What do you think of a job guarantee?
Well, I think that would be a sensible way to go. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about universal basic income, but I'm not really in favour of a universal basic income. I think the job guarantee is a better way to go. The universal basic income is very expensive because everyone gets it. Even Warren Buffett would be getting the universal basic income. And I think, to my mind, I can't see any reason with a universal basic income why it doesn't just end up as a subsidy to employers. If I was, I run the map company. If I was going to employ somebody and I knew they were getting $5,000 a year from the state, why would I not just take that off the wage I'm offering?
Yeah.
You know, if I offer 20,000 now, suddenly my employee is getting 5,000 from the government, then next employee, I can say, right, we're only getting 15,000 because the government's giving you the other 5,000.
Yeah, yeah.
And you could say, well, we're going to pass legislation to prevent it, but over time it will happen because they just won't put the wages up or whatever. So, and because it's paid to everyone, the universal basic income is going to be at a very low level. So it's not really going to provide a decent living, for anyone. It'll be a sort of maybe a little bit better than universal credit, but not much.
Right.
So I think if we target the money onto those who actually want a job but can't get one, which is what the job guarantee does. And the job guarantee basically provides state funding to the council, voluntary organisations, community groups, whatever. If you want to, I don't know, put all the iron railings back in S-Bank that were chopped out in 1940 for the war effort. You could say we're going to set up a community scheme to train some welders and whatever to do the railings, and we'll get funding from the state to employ that person under the job guarantee, and they set to work, or visiting people in care homes, picking up litter, clearing exotic vegetation, all the sort of things that need done, but which the market is never going to do.
You could fix all the potholes.
And the big thing about the job guarantee is it would pay, say, a living wage, £10 an hour, something like that. So you'd still have basic welfare for those who, for one reason or another, couldn't or wouldn't work. So it's not workfare. You're not forced to take a job guarantee post. It would provide training, and it's true for, I think, pretty much all employers. It's much easier to get a job if you're in a job.
Yeah, yeah.
As soon as you're unemployed, the employer thinks, "Hang on a minute, there must be something wrong. Why are they unemployed? Were they disruptive or incompetent or whatever?"
It sounds very much to my uneconomic ears a bit like FDR's New Deal.
Yeah, I think it probably is. He set up schemes all over the place, the Tennessee Valley schemes and all of that sort of thing to get people back to work. And again, another thing with the universal basic income that I don't like is it's a bit defeatist. It says, well, we can't really do anything about the job, so we'll just give you some money and sit at home and watch the TV. People don't want to do that. They want, most people don't work because they just want money. They want to meet people in the office. They want to, a lot of people find their partner through meeting somebody at work. It gives you a status, something to do. And the UBI fails on all of those, but it doesn't do anything for you. You're just left at home watching, daytime TV.
Oh, gracious. I say it was. See, we're coming close to the end of the time that we've got. Oh, yes. Your questioner on Periscope has said, thank you very much, Tim, for a very comprehensive answer. The plaudits continue. What can I say? Well, we're almost out of time. Thank you very much for that, Tim. It's good of you to give up the time.
You're welcome.
And I just found it absolutely fascinating.
Do maybe encourage people to join the Scottish Currency Facebook group, or perhaps visit the reservebank.scot website.
There you are, folks. That's what you need to do. Right after this is gone, go to the website and learn more about what Tim and his colleagues are doing. I think you'll find it very interesting. Tim, thanks very much. Our time's almost up. We've just got a minute or two to go. Thank you for joining us tonight, folks, and thank you for your questions. I think this is the first time we've managed to get through all the questions, and there have been plenty of them. We've got a formidable list of guests coming up. Next week, the Nation talks to Karen van Sweden. So join us at 7 p.m. next Wednesday to hear what Karen has to say. And oh, by the way, look out for my Constitution column on Sunday. I think you're going to like it. If you're terribly fond of the BBC, you might not want to read it, honestly. But if you feel that they perhaps could do a bit more, then you might want to read it. I think whatever way you go, I think you'll find it interesting. And please, this is very important, support IndyLive. Write in and tell them if you like the show. Many of you have done. But IndyLive has loads of offerings right across the board every day of the week. Support IndyLive because, as they say, don't just criticize the media, become the media. That's what we're doing on the TNT Show. Thank you again for joining us. And remember, it's been a great day for democracy. Take care. Look after yourselves. Stay safe. Good night, all.
The What's On guide to live stream events and shows is now available. You can find the guide on the web at independencelive.net, on multiple Facebook pages, or go direct with the web link tvl.ink/What's On Guide. Hello, my name's Steve B and I'm a presenter on IndyLive Radio. I present Music and Musings every Friday night at 7. The music, that's 70s classic rock, although we will take the occasional side road. The musings, well, they're thoughts on Scottish independence, politics and world events from my viewpoint, which is that of a grumpy old man. So join me every Friday night at 7 on IndyLive Radio, a new voice for a new Scotland.
Hi, I'm Fiona from Clackmannan Show Women for Independence. Did you know we have a podcast on IndyLive Radio? Goes out at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, repeated at 6 o'clock on a Thursday. Come and join us for some news, views, opinions, the odd poem. It'd be very nice to have you with us. And come and hear the news you're not getting. Here's some new voices for a new Scotland at IndyLive Radio.
What's On guide to live stream events and shows is now available. You can find the guide on the web at independencelive.net, on multiple Facebook pages, or go direct with the web link tvl.ink/What's On Guide.
Film, you can watch this again, you can be part of it. It's Independence Live, yeah. A few people asked about YouTube. It'll be YouTube/Independence Live. That's where you'll find the footage.
The What's On guide to live stream events and shows is now available. You can find the guide on the web at independencelive.net, on multiple Facebook pages, or go direct with the web link tvl.ink/What's On Guide.
Hi there, I'm Cliff.
And I'm Russ.
And we're from the Veterans for Scottish Independence 2.0 group. And we're just invading your privacy today to let you know that we will be very shortly pushing a program out on live stream to do with the veterans, their needs, as it will be during an independent campaign, the next independence campaign, and indeed in independent Scotland.
So get yourself in gear, come and join us, and pull up a sandbag.
Yes.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.